Have you ever felt invisible, as if your life became smaller with each passing year? Elara knew that feeling well at 53, she had watched her dreams fade into endless days of serving others who barely saw her as human. When her village turns against her with accusations of witchcraft, she flees into the dark forest they all fear. There, she expects to die alone. Instead, she finds the ancient vampire the townspeople whisper about, but he doesn't attack her. He offers her tea, books, and the first kindness she's known in decades. His crumbling castle becomes her sanctuary. But when the villagers come hunting with torches and rage, she must make an impossible choice. Will she stand beside the monster who showed her mercy, or return to a world that never valued her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stone bells of Ravenshollow tolled 6 times, their bronze voices echoing off weathered cottage walls as dawn broke grey and cold over the village. Elara Whitmore pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the courtyard behind her sister-in-law's house, her bare feet silent on the frost-covered stones. The wedding ring on her finger caught the pale morning light, a simple band of gold, worn thin after 30 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood. She twisted it absently, a habit that brought neither comfort nor pain anymore, just the familiar weight of memory. The wash basin waited for her, as it had every morning since Thomas died. Margaret never rose before 8, but expected her laundry clean and her breakfast ready by the time she descended the narrow wooden stairs. Elara dipped her hands into the icy water and began scrubbing the previous day's stains from linen chemises and woolen stockings. Her fingers, once soft and white, now bore the marks of 3 decades spent in service, first to her husband's quiet needs, then to his family's louder demands. Thomas had been different from the other men in Ravenshollow. He'd read books, real books, not just the holy texts Father Benedict proclaimed were sufficient for any Christian soul. In the early years of their marriage, he would share passages with her by candlelight, his voice gentle as he read tales of distant lands and forgotten kingdoms. Those were the nights she treasured most, when the world expanded beyond washing and cooking and tending to his mother's endless complaints. Books fill a woman's head with foolish notions, Margaret had said after the funeral, packing Thomas's small library into a wooden crate. Better to focus on practical matters. The books had disappeared the next day, sold to a traveling merchant for copper coins that went toward winter firewood. The village of Ravenshollow sat in a narrow valley between rolling hills, its 50-odd cottages clustered around a small stone church like sheep huddled against wolves. Beyond the cultivated fields and pastures, dark woods pressed close on 3 sides, ancient oaks and towering pines that had stood since before the first stones were laid for St. Bede's Chapel. The forest held secrets that older villagers still whispered about, strange lights glimpsed between the trees, livestock found drained of blood with mysterious wounds, travelers who entered the wood and never emerged. The shadow haunts those woods. Old Henrik would mutter over his ale at the village's single tavern, something that should have died centuries ago. The other men would nod and cross themselves, but Elara had always wondered what it might be like to walk among those towering trees, to see what lay beyond the familiar borders of her small world. Father Benedict emerged from the chapel as she hung the last of Margaret's washing on the line. He was a stern man, with greying hair and eyes like winter stones, who preached fire and judgment every Sunday from his wooden pulpit. His gaze found her across the courtyard, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever he looked at her too long. "Good morning, Father," she called, forcing warmth into her voice. He approached with measured steps, his black robes rustling against the morning grass. "Sister Elara, I trust you are keeping yourself busy with righteous work." "Always, Father." She gestured toward the drying laundry. "Margaret's needs keep me well occupied." His eyes narrowed slightly. I've heard troubling reports. Young Willem mentioned you've been walking near the forest edge. Willem was the village blacksmith, barely 25, but already skilled at his trade. Unlike the other young men who barely acknowledged her existence, he sometimes nodded politely when their paths crossed, even helped her carry heavy baskets from the market. The idea that he had been watching her movements sent a chill through her. "Heart, I gather herbs for cooking," she said carefully. "Surely there's no harm in that." "There is harm in approaching places where evil dwells." Father Benedict stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The forest is cursed, sister. Ancient wickedness sleeps beneath those trees. A godly woman has no business venturing where shadows hold sway." Elara lowered her eyes, the practiced gesture of submission she'd perfected over decades of marriage. "Of course, Father. I meant no disrespect." But even as she spoke the expected words, rebellion stirred in her heart. What wickedness could there be in morning sunlight filtering through oak leaves, or the sweet scent of wild roses blooming along forgotten paths? She had walked those borderlands many times in recent months, drawn by a longing she couldn't name, and found nothing but peace in the gentle whisper of wind through branches. Father Benedict studied her face for a long moment before nodding curtly and continuing toward the village square. Elara watched him go, then turned back to her work, but the morning's tranquility had been shattered. Margaret appeared in the doorway as Elara entered the cottage, her plump face already set in lines of displeasure. At 48, she was 5 years younger than Elara, but looked older, her brown hair streaked with premature grey, and her mouth turned down in perpetual disapproval. "The priest was speaking with you," she observed, settling heavily into her chair by the window. "What did he want?" "Nothing of importance." Elara moved toward the kitchen alcove, where yesterday's bread waited to be sliced and the fire needed building. "Shall I prepare your breakfast?" Obviously. Margaret's tone suggested the question was foolish. "And after that, you'll need to mend my blue dress. The hem has come loose again." Elara nodded and began her tasks, but her mind wandered as her hands worked. How many mornings had she lived exactly like this one? How many more? Stretched ahead, each identical to the last until age or illness finally brought release? The thought filled her with a desperation she quickly pushed away. Such feelings were sinful, ungrateful. She had shelter, food, purpose. Many widows faced far worse fates. But as she stirred porridge and sliced bread, her eyes drifted toward the small window that faced the forest. Somewhere beyond those trees lay mysteries she would never explore, knowledge she would never gain, adventures that belonged to younger women with different lives. The wedding ring felt heavier on her finger, no longer a symbol of love, but a chain that bound her to duty and diminished expectations. The morning progressed in its familiar pattern. Margaret complained about the weather, the porridge, the way Elara arranged the kindling. She spoke of village gossip with relish, who had been seen speaking to whom, which families were struggling with debt, whose daughters were showing too much ankle in their daily dress. "That Miller girl has been acting strange," Margaret said around a mouthful of bread. "Walking alone at odd hours, talking to herself. Mark my words, there's something unnatural about that family." Elara's hand stilled on the mending in her lap. Sarah Miller was barely 16, a quiet girl who helped her father with his trade. Strange how? Muttering words in a language that isn't Christian. Old Henrik saw her picking herbs by moonlight, drawing symbols in the dirt. Margaret leaned forward conspiratorially. "Some say she's been practicing witchcraft." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Witchcraft was the gravest accusation that could be leveled against any woman in Ravenshollow, carrying with it the promise of trial, exile, or worse. Elara had seen what happened to women who attracted such suspicion, how quickly neighbors turned away, how swiftly aid and comfort disappeared. "Surely that's just gossip," Elara said carefully. "Gossip has a way of revealing truth." Margaret's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Father Benedict has been asking questions. If there's a witch among us, she'll be found." The afternoon brought a blessed reprieve when Margaret departed to visit her friend Agnes across the village. Elara found herself alone for the first time in days, free to move through the cottage without scrutiny or criticism. She completed her assigned tasks quickly, then stood in the doorway, looking out at the autumn landscape. The forest called to her as it had so many times before, its shadows offering mystery instead of judgment, silence instead of constant demands. Before she could reconsider, she wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and stepped into the fading daylight. The path to the forest edge wound between harvested fields, where stubble poked through patches of frost. Elara had walked this route dozens of times over the past months, drawn by impulses she didn't fully understand. Each journey brought a sense of freedom that lasted long after she returned to her duties. The trees rose before her like the walls of a cathedral, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the late afternoon sun into patterns of gold and green. She paused at the border between field and forest, remembering Father Benedict's warnings, then stepped forward into the cooler air beneath the oaks. Here, surrounded by the gentle sounds of wind and rustling leaves, she could breathe fully for the first time all day. No one watched her movements or questioned her thoughts. No one demanded service or submission. She was simply Elara, a woman walking in a beautiful place, allowed to exist without justification or apology. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she noticed the carved symbols. They were small, easily missed unless you looked carefully, marks scratched into the bark of an ancient oak that stood beside the path. The symbols meant nothing to her, but something about their precise geometry suggested they were more than random scratches. Curious, she knelt beside the tree and traced one of the marks with her fingertip. It was a circle containing what looked like intertwined branches, or perhaps letters from an alphabet she didn't recognize. There were 6 symbols in total, arranged in 2 rows, each carved with obvious care and intention. A sound in the distance made her look up, voices approaching from the direction of the village. Elara rose quickly and began walking back toward home, but the symbols remained vivid in her memory. Someone had carved them recently. The wood was still pale, where bark had been removed. But who would venture this far into the forest to leave such marks, and why? The voices grew louder as she emerged from the trees. 3 men walked along the field path, deep in conversation. She recognized Willem the blacksmith, Father Benedict, and Marcus Webb, a prosperous farmer whose opinion carried weight in village matters. Sister Elara. Father Benedict's voice stopped her before she could reach the cottage. An interesting place for an evening walk. Willem looked uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding hers as the 3 men approached. Marcus Webb studied her with open suspicion, his weathered face set in stern lines. "I was gathering herbs," she said, raising the small bundle of wild mint she had picked along the way. "Indeed." Father Benedict's gaze was piercing. "And did you find what you were seeking in those shadow-touched woods?" The question carried meanings beyond its surface, implications that made her heart race with sudden fear. Only what God provides for those who search honestly. "Father," Marcus Webb stepped forward, his bulk intimidating in the fading light. "Honest searches don't require secrecy. My wife saw you walking toward the forest just after sunset 3 days past." Elara's mouth went dry. She hadn't realized anyone was watching her movements so carefully, tracking her comings and goings like a suspicious animal. "I meant no harm. The woods are peaceful, a place for prayer and reflection." "Prayer is best conducted in church," Father Benedict said coldly. "Reflection requires no journey into cursed lands where evil things hold dominion." Willem finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Sister Elara has always been known for her godliness. Godliness that draws her to forbidden places." Marcus's tone was skeptical. "Strange behavior invites strange conclusions." The 3 men exchanged glances that spoke of discussions she hadn't been part of, decisions made without her knowledge. Elara felt the weight of their combined scrutiny like a physical burden. pressing down on her shoulders and making it difficult to breathe normally. "I should return to my duties," she said, stepping toward the cottage. "Margaret will be expecting her supper." "Indeed you should," Father Benedict agreed. "And perhaps you might consider confining your walks to the village proper, for your own safety, of course." The words were phrased as a suggestion, but Elara heard the command beneath them. She nodded once and hurried toward home, feeling their eyes on her back until she reached the cottage door. Inside, she sat at the small table where she took her meals and tried to calm her racing heart. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. In their questions and suspicious glances, she had glimpsed how quickly a woman's life could unravel in Ravenshollow. One day you were a respectable widow, performing your expected duties. The next, you were the subject of whispered conversations and careful watching. But even as fear settled in her chest, another emotion stirred alongside it. For 30 years, she had lived exactly as others expected, the dutiful wife, the grieving widow, the grateful dependent. She had shaped her thoughts and desires to match what was deemed proper for a woman of her station. And where had it brought her? To a cottage that wasn't hers, performing tasks for a woman who barely tolerated her presence, growing smaller and more invisible with each passing day. The forest had offered something different, a place where she could exist without explanation, where her thoughts were her own and her steps followed paths she chose rather than duties imposed by others. The symbols carved in the oak tree suggested she wasn't the only one who found meaning in those quiet spaces between the trees. Margaret returned as darkness settled over the village, full of gossip from her afternoon visit. She spoke at length about Agnes's rheumatism, the rising price of winter grain, and the shocking behavior of young women who showed too much independence in their daily conduct. "Agnes thinks there may be truth to the rumors about the Miller girl," she said, as Elara served a simple supper of bread and soup. "Strange lights have been seen near their cottage at night." "What sort of lights?" Elara asked despite herself. "Unnatural ones, green and blue flames that dance without wood to feed them." Margaret's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper. "The work of someone trafficking with dark forces." Elara spooned soup into her own bowl and said nothing, but her mind turned to the symbols carved in the oak tree. Were they connected to these rumors of unnatural lights? Was someone in Ravenshollow practicing arts that went beyond Christian prayer and proper medicine? The possibility should have frightened her, but instead she felt a strange excitement. If such things were real, if there were indeed mysteries hidden in the familiar world around her, then perhaps her life wasn't as small and predetermined as she had believed. That night, as Margaret snored in the cottage's single bed while Elara made do with a straw pallet on the floor, she lay awake thinking about the forest and the symbols and the way Father Benedict's eyes had studied her face for signs of guilt or deception. 3 years of widowhood had taught her that a woman alone in Ravenshollow survived by making herself useful and invisible, by never drawing attention or raising questions about her character. But 3 years had also taught her that such survival came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Outside the cottage window, wind moved through the oak branches with a sound like whispered secrets. Somewhere beyond the village's stone walls, mysteries waited in the darkness between the trees. And despite every rational reason for caution, Elara found herself planning another walk along the forest's edge, drawn by the promise of something larger than duty and resignation. Her wedding ring caught moonlight from the window, a circle of worn gold that had once symbolized love and partnership, but now felt like a shackle binding her to expectations that grew heavier each day. She twisted it slowly, wondering what would happen if she simply stopped wearing it, stopped defining herself by the relationships that had shaped her past. The thought was dangerous, rebellious in ways that could bring swift punishment in a place like Ravenshollow. But as sleep finally claimed her, Elara held it close like a secret treasure, a small flame of possibility that might one day grow into something bright enough to light her way toward a different kind of life. The blight came with the October rains, seeping into Ravenshollow like poison through an open wound. First, the wheat in Marcus Webb's northern field turned black at the roots, the stalks withering overnight despite the healthy harvest just weeks before. Then Henrik's prized milk cow fell sick with a fever that left her hide covered in strange purple welts. By week's end, half the village livestock showed signs of the mysterious ailment, and panic began to spread faster than the disease itself. Elara first noticed the sickness when Willem brought his mare to the cottage, the animal, trembling and foam-flecked, despite the cool morning air. The horse's eyes showed white around the edges, and dark veins stood out against her pale coat like ink spilled beneath the skin. "Can you help her?" Willem asked, his young face creased with worry. "The other horses in my stable are starting to show the same signs." Elara examined the mare carefully, running gentle hands along her neck and flanks. The fever burned hot beneath the animal's skin, but the pattern of symptoms reminded her of something Thomas had once described, a cattle sickness his father had treated with a particular combination of herbs. "I might be able to ease her suffering," she said carefully, "but I'll need to gather certain plants." Willem's relief was evident. "Whatever you need. The other men are saying we should put down any animal that shows the sickness, but she's been with my family since I was a boy." Elara prepared a poultice from ingredients she gathered along the forest's edge: willow bark for the fever, comfrey root for the skin irritation, and a pale moss that grew only in the deepest shade of the ancient oaks. She mixed them with honey and wrapped the mixture in clean cloth, then applied it to the worst of the mare's welts. "Change the dressing twice daily," she instructed Willem, "and give her water mixed with this." She handed him a small bag of dried herbs. "Just a pinch in each bucket." 3 days later, Willem returned with news that made her heart race with equal parts pride and terror. His mare was recovering, the fever broken, and the ugly welts beginning to fade. Word had spread through the village like wildfire. Elara Whitmore had cured the blight that was killing their animals. "Can you help my cow?" asked Robert the miller, appearing at her door with desperation in his eyes. "She's the only one I have left." Soon, a steady stream of villagers brought their sick animals to the cottage behind Margaret's house. Elara treated them all with variations of her herbal remedy, adjusting the mixture based on each creature's symptoms. Most began to recover within days, their owners returning with grateful faces and small gifts of bread or preserved fruit. But gratitude, Elara soon learned, could transform into suspicion with terrifying speed. "It's unnatural," she heard Margaret whisper to Agnes one morning as they passed the cottage. "No godly woman should have such knowledge of healing. Where did she learn such arts?" Father Benedict appeared at her door the following afternoon, his grey eyes cold as winter stone. Behind him stood Marcus Webb and 2 other village elders, their faces set in stern lines of judgment. "Sister Elara," Father Benedict began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for sermons, "there are questions that must be answered about your recent activities." Elara's hands stilled on the herbs she was sorting, her heart beginning to race. "What questions, Father?" "The source of your knowledge troubles many in the Menine, the village. Healing arts of this nature are not learned from prayer and scripture alone." Marcus Webb stepped forward, his bulk filling the cottage doorway. "My wife says she saw you gathering plants by moonlight, speaking words that weren't Latin or any Christian tongue." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. She had indeed been gathering herbs in the early morning hours, when dew made them most potent. But she spoke only to herself, fragments of half-remembered lullabies Thomas had sung, bits of poetry from the books that were long gone. "I gather herbs when they're fresh with dew," she said carefully, "and I sometimes hum while I work. Surely there's no sin in that." "Humming," repeated one of the elders, his tone making the innocent word sound ominous. "Or chanting." Father Benedict studied her face with the intensity of a man reading scripture. "There are symbols carved in the oak trees near where you walk, old markings that predate Christian settlement in this valley." Elara's blood turned to ice, the symbols she had discovered weeks ago, the mysterious carvings that had sparked her curiosity. Somehow they knew about those. I know nothing of any symbols, she said, which was technically true. She had found them but understood nothing of their meaning. Yet you walk where they stand, Marcus pressed. You gather your herbs from ground marked by pagan signs. The cottage felt smaller with each word, the walls pressing close as the men's suspicions filled the space around her. Elara realized that every innocent action, her walks in the forest, her knowledge of healing herbs, even her success in treating the sick animals, was being woven into a tapestry of guilt. The Lord provides healing through many means, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Surely using his gifts to ease suffering is a Christian act. Father Benedict's laugh held no warmth. The devil can also provide knowledge, sister, and his gifts always come with a price. That evening, Margaret confronted her with barely contained fury. Her sister-in-law's face was flushed with anger and what looked disturbingly like excitement at having scandal so close to home. "How could you be so foolish?" Margaret hissed as she paced the small cottage. "Drawing attention to yourself with such bizarre behavior. People are talking, Elara. They're saying things that could destroy what little standing you have left." "I helped sick animals," Elara protested. "I use simple herbs that any village-wise woman might know." "Any village-wise woman or any village witch?" Margaret stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare full of venom. "Do you think I haven't noticed your strange habits these past months? The way you slip out before dawn, the secretive way you handle those plant mixtures, the books you think I don't know you had hidden under your pallet." Elara's heart stopped. "What books? Don't play innocent with me." Margaret moved to a wooden chest in the corner and withdrew a small wrapped bundle. "I found these weeks ago while cleaning. Strange books with symbols I don't recognize, written in languages that aren't Latin." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal 3 small volumes that Elara had never seen before. They were bound in dark leather and covered with the same mysterious symbols she had found carved in the forest oak. The sight of them made her feel dizzy with confusion and growing terror. "Those aren't mine," she whispered. "I've never seen them before in my life." "Found under your pallet, wrapped in your own shawl." Margaret's voice carried triumphant malice. "Along with dried herbs tied with black thread, and what looks like ritual implements." More items emerged from the bundle, things that Elara truly had never seen. A small knife with symbols etched in the blade, bundles of herbs she didn't recognize, pouches of strange powders that smelled of earth and something darker. "Someone put those there," Elara said, her voice rising with panic. "I swear on Thomas's grave, I've never seen any of those things." "Then how did they come to be in your possession?" Margaret's eyes glittered with satisfied hatred. "Will you claim some invisible hand placed them there while we slept?" The trap was perfect, Elara realized with sick certainty. Someone had planted evidence of witchcraft among her few belongings, knowing that her recent healing successes would make such accusations believable. But who would go to such lengths to destroy her? And why? The answer came with a knock at the cottage door. Father Benedict entered without invitation, followed by Marcus Webb and 4 other village men. Their faces were set in the stern lines of righteous judgment. "Sister Elara," Father Benedict announced formally, "you are accused of practicing witchcraft and trafficking with dark forces. Evidence has been brought forward that requires immediate investigation." Margaret stepped forward with theatrical reluctance, presenting the mysterious books and implements. "I discovered these hidden among her possessions. She claims no knowledge of them, but they were wrapped in her own belongings." The men examined the items with growing alarm. One of the books fell open to a page covered with intricate diagrams and symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. Marcus Webb recoiled as if the pages might burn him. "This is the devil's work," he breathed. "No Christian soul should possess such unholy texts." Father Benedict closed the book with a sharp snap. "Where did you acquire these volumes, sister?" "I didn't acquire them," Elara said desperately. "I've never seen them before tonight. Someone placed them among my things without my knowledge." "And who might have done such a thing?" Father Benedict's tone suggested he found her explanation absurd. What enemy do you have who would risk their own soul by handling such cursed objects? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Elara looked around the circle of accusing faces and realized that her protest of innocence only made her appear more guilty. In a village like Ravenshollow, possession of such items was evidence enough of guilt, regardless of how they had come to be found. The symbols in these books match those carved in the forest oak, Marcus observed, comparing a page to a piece of bark he produced from his coat. She has been conducting rituals in the sacred woods. I found those symbols. I didn't carve them, Elara protested, but her words sounded weak even to her own ears. The evidence speaks clearly, Father Benedict declared. Tomorrow at dawn, you will be examined by the village council. If these accusations prove true, you will face the consequences that God's law demands. The men departed, taking the mysterious books and implements with them as evidence. Margaret stood by the window, her face lit with satisfaction. You should have been more careful, she said, without turning around. But perhaps this is God's way of removing a burden from my household. Elara spent the night sitting by the dying fire, her mind racing through the events that had brought her to this moment. Someone had carefully orchestrated her downfall, planting evidence and using her innocent healing work as proof of supernatural knowledge. But who had access to her belongings? Who knew enough about her forest walks to connect them with the carved symbols? As dawn approached, she heard voices gathering in the village square. The trial would be swift and decisive. Father Benedict's word carried absolute authority in matters of faith and morality. By sunset, she would likely be banished from Ravenshollow, forced to wander as an outcast in a world that offered no mercy to women accused of witchcraft. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another day of autumn storms. Elara rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the forest that had brought her. Such peace, and now promised to be her salvation or her doom. If she was going to face exile, perhaps it was time to discover what truly waited among those ancient trees. The cottage door stood between her and a future she couldn't control. Behind her lay the familiar world of duty and service that had shaped every day of her adult life. Ahead lay the unknown darkness of the forest, and whatever mysteries it held. She reached for her cloak, her decision made. If she was to be branded a witch, regardless of her innocence, perhaps it was time to discover what that truly meant. The forest swallowed Elara like a living thing, branches closing behind her as she stumbled deeper into shadows that seemed to move with purpose. Rain began to fall in earnest, cold droplets finding their way through the canopy to soak her woolen cloak and plasticize her graying hair against her skull. She had no destination, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and the village that had turned against her with such swift cruelty. Her feet, accustomed to smooth cottage floors and well-worn paths, protested against the uneven ground. Roots caught at her skirts, thorns tore at her sleeves, and more than once she stumbled over fallen logs hidden beneath carpets of damp leaves. But she pressed on, driven by the certain knowledge that capture meant exile at best, death at worst. The accusations would spread through Ravenshollow like fire through dry wheat. By morning, every villager would know that Elara Whitmore had been found with forbidden books and ritual implements. The fact that she had fled in the night would only confirm her guilt in their minds. There would be no trial, no chance to prove her innocence, only the swift justice that communities like Ravenshollow dispensed to those who threatened their carefully maintained order. Thunder rolled overhead as the storm intensified, and Elara realized she was hopelessly lost. The paths she had walked so often in daylight became alien landscapes in the darkness. Familiar landmarks transformed into threatening shapes that seemed to watch her passage. She pulled her cloak tighter and tried to find shelter beneath the spreading branches of an enormous oak, but the rain found her anyway, soaking through wool and linen until her teeth chattered with cold. It was then, as she huddled against the ancient tree's trunk, that she saw the lights. They appeared between the trees like fallen stars, pale blue flames that danced without apparent fuel. They moved with deliberate grace, weaving between the trunks in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random natural occurrence. Elara watched in fascination as the lights drew closer, their ethereal glow casting shifting shadows on the forest floor. Fear told her to run, but exhaustion had settled into her bones like lead. She remained pressed against the oak's rough bark as the lights encircled her, their gentle radiance warming her chilled skin despite their otherworldly nature. They pulsed in rhythm, like a great heart beating in the darkness, and she found herself strangely comforted by their presence. "Lost, are you?" The voice came from the shadows beyond the lights, deep and cultured, with an accent she couldn't place. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs as a figure stepped into the circle of blue flames, and she found herself looking upon the most beautiful man she had ever seen. He appeared to be perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair that caught silver highlights from the dancing flames and pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. His clothing was fine, a long coat of midnight blue over dark trousers and polished boots, but styled in a fashion she didn't recognize. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I mean no harm." Harm. His lips curved in what might have been amusement. "I should think you're the one in danger here, wandering alone in these woods on such a night." The lights continued their gentle dance around them, casting his features in alternating shadow and radiance. His eyes, she realized, were an unusual shade of grey-green, like storm clouds over deep water. "Are you injured?" he asked, stepping closer with movements that seemed to make no sound on the leaf-strewn ground. Elara shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Every muscle in her body ached from the unaccustomed exertion of her flight, and her hands were scratched and bleeding from her encounters with thorns. "Merely lost then, and fleeing something, I would guess." His tone held no judgment, only quiet observation. "The village, perhaps." She stared at him in shocked silence. How could he possibly know where she had come from, or why she was running through the forest in the middle of a storm? "Your clothing marks you as one of Ravenshallow's residents," he explained, as if reading her thoughts. "And few venture into these woods willingly, especially not alone at night during a tempest." "They think I'm a witch," she said, surprised by her own honesty. Something about his calm presence invited confession. "Are you?" The question was asked with such casual interest that it took her a moment to process it fully. In Ravenshallow, such an accusation was tantamount to a death sentence. Here, in the darkness, surrounded by dancing lights that had no natural explanation, it seemed almost reasonable. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "They found things among my belongings that I had never seen before, books with strange symbols, implements I didn't recognize. But I've never practiced any arts beyond simple herb healing." He studied her for a long moment, his unusual eyes seeming to look through her rather than at her. "And yet you healed animals that others could not cure. You've been walking in these woods for months, drawn by instincts you couldn't name. Tell me, Elara Whitmore, do you believe in magic?" Her name on his lips sent a shock through her system. "How do you know who I am?" "These woods hold many secrets, and I am their guardian. I've watched you walking among the trees, seen the way you touch the carved symbols with wonder rather than fear." He gestured toward the dancing lights. "Magic surrounds us, whether we acknowledge it or not." The flames pulsed brighter at his words, and Elara felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest. "What are you?" Instead of answering directly, he extended one pale hand toward her. Cold, wet and exhausted, not the ideal conditions for philosophical discussions. "My home isn't far. Will you allow me to offer you shelter until the storm passes?" Every rational thought screamed warnings about accepting help from a stranger encountered under such bizarre circumstances. But rational thought had brought her nothing but 30 years of servitude, followed by false accusations and exile. She looked into his storm-colored eyes and saw something she hadn't encountered in longer than she could remember, genuine kindness without expectation of service in return. "I have nothing to offer in payment," she said. "I ask for none." He stepped closer, and she caught a scent like old books and winter pine. "Come, the night is young, and these woods can be dangerous for those who don't understand their ways." She took his offered hand, and immediately felt warmth flowing from his skin to hers, despite the fact that he should have been as chilled as she was by the storm. His touch was gentle but sure, and when he began leading her deeper into the forest, the dancing lights moved with them like a honor guard. They walked in comfortable silence through the darkness, following paths that seemed to appear beneath their feet as they moved. The storm continued overhead, but somehow very little rain reached them beneath the canopy, as if the trees themselves were providing protection. Elara found herself studying her mysterious rescuer as they walked, noting the way he moved without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf, the way small woodland creatures emerged from hiding to watch their passage without apparent fear. After what felt like an hour, but could have been minutes, time seemed fluid in this place. They emerged into a clearing where an ancient castle stood against the storm-dark sky. It was not the grand fortress she might have imagined, but rather a structure that had grown from the landscape itself, built of the same grey stone that formed the valley's bones. Ivy covered much of its walls, and warm light glowed from windows set deep in walls that had clearly stood for centuries. "Welcome," her companion said, his voice carrying formal courtesy, "to my home." The castle's interior revealed wonders that made Elara's breath catch in her throat. What had appeared ancient and crumbling from the outside transformed into rooms filled with impossible beauty. Tapestries in rich blues and golds covered stone walls, their threads seeming to shimmer with their own light. Furniture carved from dark wood gleamed with careful maintenance, and everywhere she looked, books lined shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. "Please, sit by the fire," her host said, gesturing toward a chair upholstered in deep burgundy velvet. "You must be chilled to the bone." A fire burned cheerfully in a massive stone hearth, its flames dancing in shades of gold and amber that cast dancing shadows across the room. Elara approached hesitantly, still overwhelmed by the contrast between her desperate flight through the storm and this haven of warmth and comfort. "I don't even know your name," she said as she settled into the chair, which proved to be the most comfortable seat she had experienced in years. "Lucian," he replied, moving to a sideboard where crystal decanters caught the firelight. "Lucian Blackthorn, and you are most welcome in my home, Elara." He poured amber liquid into 2 glasses and offered her one. The brandy burned pleasantly as it warmed her from within, and she felt some of the tension leaving her shoulders for the first time since the accusations had begun. "This is beautiful," she said, looking around the room with wonder. "How long have you lived here?" Something flickered across Lucian's face, an expression too quick to interpret. "Longer than most would consider natural. This castle has been my home for centuries." The casual way he spoke of centuries should have alarmed her, but somehow it didn't. After the blue flames in the forest and her mysterious rescue, the normal rules of possibility seemed suspended. Instead, she found herself curious about what it would mean to live for so long. "Centuries of solitude?" she asked. "Mostly." He settled into the chair across from hers, cradling his own glass. "Though I've watched over the village and its people during that time." "A silent guardian, you might say." "Watched over us?" Elara leaned forward, intrigued. "But the villagers speak of you as something to be feared." Lucian's laugh held no bitterness, only quiet amusement. "Fear is easier than understanding. They know something ancient dwells in these woods, and their imaginations supply the rest. Are you ancient?" "Yes." No hesitation, no attempt to soften the truth. "I am what your people would call a vampire, though I suspect your village stories bear little resemblance to reality." The word should have sent her fleeing toward the door, But instead, Elara found herself studying his face with new understanding. The pale skin, the graceful movements, the way he seemed to belong to the shadows and firelight equally. "You drink blood," she said, more statement than question. "I require it to survive, yes, but not as your stories suggest." He met her gaze directly. "I take only what is freely given, and I harm no one. The missing livestock, your village whispers about they died of the same blight that brought you to my attention." Relief flooded through her, though she wasn't entirely sure why his reassurance mattered so much. "Then you're not the monster they believe you to be." "We're all monsters in someone's story," Lucian said quietly. "The question is whether we choose to be the monster in our own." Elara sipped her brandy and considered this. In Ravenshollow, she had been cast as the villain, the witch who threatened their safety and order. But here, in this impossible place with this extraordinary man, she felt more herself than she had in decades. "Tell me about your books," she said, gesturing toward the shelves that lined the walls. His face brightened with genuine pleasure. "What would you like to know?" "Everything." The word slipped out before she could stop it, carrying with it years of suppressed curiosity. "I used to read when my husband was alive, but after he died, they said books weren't appropriate for a woman in my position." Lucian rose and moved to one of the shelves, running his fingers along leather spines with the reverence others reserved for holy relics. "Knowledge belongs to anyone brave enough to seek it. Gender, position, age, these are artificial barriers created by those who fear learning's power." He selected a slim volume bound in midnight blue leather and returned to her side. "This is a collection of pressed flowers from around the world, gathered over 3 centuries. Each one tells a story of the place where it grew." Elara opened the book with trembling fingers and found herself looking at specimens more beautiful than anything she had imagined. Roses from distant mountains, orchids from tropical jungles, delicate wildflowers from meadows. She would never see each one preserved with such care that they seemed ready to release their fragrance at her touch. "You collected all of these?" "Travel was easier in earlier centuries," Lucian said. "Before the world became so divided by suspicion and fear, I've walked in gardens that no longer exist, seen flowers that have vanished from the earth." "That's heartbreaking," Elara murmured, touching a particularly lovely specimen that reminded her of the wild roses growing along Ravenshallow's borders. "But also beautiful. Nothing lasts forever, but some things can be preserved, remembered, cherished for what they were." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. Like this moment. Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and Elara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the brandy or the fire. When was the last time someone had looked at her with such gentle attention? When had anyone treated her thoughts and curiosity as worthy of respect? "You must think me foolish," she said, suddenly aware of how she must appear, a middle-aged village woman fleeing accusations of witchcraft, fascinated by things any educated person would take for granted. "I think you're remarkable," Lucian replied without hesitation. "You've spent 30 years caring for others who gave you little in return, yet you retain wonder and kindness. You were accused of witchcraft for healing sick animals, which tells me more about your accuser's character than your own." Tears pricked at Elara's eyes. "I don't feel remarkable. I feel small and frightened and utterly lost. Perhaps being lost is the first step toward finding yourself." Lucian leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Tell me, when you walked in my forests these past months, what did you feel?" "Free," she answered immediately, then blushed at her own honesty. "Then you weren't lost at all. You were finding your way home." The word home hung between them like a promise. Elara looked around the beautiful room, at the books and the fire and the man who had offered her sanctuary without asking anything in return, and felt something she had almost forgotten. Existed hope. "I can't go back," she said quietly. "Even if I wanted to, they would never accept me now. Would you want to go back?" The question struck her with unexpected force. Would she return to Margareth's cottage, to days filled with endless drudgery, and nights spent sleeping on a straw pallet. Would she choose duty and invisibility over this impossible sanctuary? No, she whispered, then stronger. No, I wouldn't. Lucian smiled, and in that expression she saw centuries of loneliness beginning to ease. Then stay, learn, discover what you were meant to become when freed from others' expectations. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the ancient stones, but inside the castle, Elara felt safer than she had ever been. For the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she belonged. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate for the gift he was offering. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing." Dawn brought revelations that changed everything. Elara thought she understood about her new sanctuary. She woke in a bed more comfortable than any she had known, soft linens that smelled of lavender, down pillows that cradled her head like clouds. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, and for a moment she forgot the circumstances that had brought her here, lost in the simple pleasure of restful sleep. Then memory returned, and with it the realization that she was no longer the woman who had fled Ravenshollow in terror. Something fundamental had shifted during the night, as if crossing the threshold of Lucian's castle had awakened parts of herself she hadn't known existed. She found him in the library, seated at a writing desk covered with papers written in languages she couldn't identify. Morning light revealed details. The firelight had softened the otherworldly pallor of his skin, the way he seemed to exist, slightly apart from the natural world around him. Yet, when he looked up at her approach, his smile held warmth that belonged entirely to the present moment. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, rising with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "Better than I have in years." She moved to the window, looking out at gardens that shouldn't have been possible. Roses bloomed in impossible profusion despite the autumn season, their colors more vivid than any she had seen. "Your gardens are extraordinary. Magic has its advantages." He joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the subtle energy that seemed to emanate from his presence. "Time moves differently here. Seasons bend to will rather than natural law. Is that how you've lived so long?" "Partly." His expression grew distant, as if looking back across centuries rather than years. "But longevity comes with a price. I've watched everyone I've ever cared for age and die while I remain unchanged. Eventually, the pain of loss becomes too much to bear, and isolation seems preferable to the certainty of grief." Elara studied his profile, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of accumulated sorrow. Until now. He turned to meet her gaze, and she saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. "You must understand, Elara, what I'm offering you isn't simple sanctuary. This place, my nature, the bond that's forming between us, it all comes with complications I'm not certain I have the right to impose." "What kind of complications?" Instead of answering directly, Lucian moved to a cabinet carved with intricate symbols and withdrew a small object wrapped in black silk. When he unfolded the cloth, she saw a delicate silver music box, its surface engraved with patterns that seemed to shift in the morning light. "This belonged to someone I loved long ago," he said quietly. "Her name was Isabella, and she was mortal, like you. I thought I could protect her from the darkness that surrounds my existence, but I was wrong." He opened the music box, and a hauntingly beautiful melody filled the room, notes that spoke of love and loss in equal measure. Elara felt tears prick at her eyes as the music washed over her, carrying emotions that transcended words. What happened to her? She grew old, while I remained young. She aged into wisdom and grace while I watched helplessly, knowing that every sunset brought us closer to separation. His voice carried pain accumulated over centuries. "When she died, I swore I would never again allow myself to care for someone whose life was measured in decades rather than centuries." The music box continued its melancholy song, each note a reminder of love's transient nature. Elara understood now why he had lived in solitude, why he had chosen the safety of isolation over the risk of attachment. "And yet you brought me here," she said softly, "against every rational thought I possess." He closed the music box with careful reverence. "From the moment I first saw you walking in my woods, you've haunted my thoughts. There's something about you, Elara, a strength beneath your apparent submission, a fire that no amount of duty and service has been able to extinguish." She felt heat rise in her cheeks at his words. No one had ever spoken to her with such intensity, such focused attention. Even Thomas, dear as he had been, had seen her as a comfortable companion rather than an object of fascination. "I'm 53 years old," she said, as if her age could explain away the connection growing between them. "My youth is long past, my beauty faded. What could possibly draw you to someone like me?" Lucian moved closer, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his storm-grey eyes. "You think beauty is about smooth skin and bright eyes? You think youth is measured in years rather than spirit?" His hand rose to touch her cheek with infinite gentleness. "I see a woman who spent 3 decades caring for others without complaint, retained kindness despite receiving little in return. I see someone who walks into unknown forests seeking beauty and wonder. I see courage that most people never develop, wisdom earned through genuine suffering." "You see things that aren't there," Elara whispered, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "I see things that others have overlooked." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "The question is whether you're brave enough to see them in yourself." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities that terrified and thrilled her equally. Then reality intruded in the form of distant voices, carrying on the morning air, voices that spoke of search parties and righteous anger. Lucian's expression hardened as he moved to the window. "They're coming." Elara joined him, looking out at the forest edge where figures moved between the trees. She could make out Father Benedict's black robes, Marcus Webb's distinctive bulk, and at least a dozen other villagers, carrying torches despite the daylight. "How did they find this place?" she asked, her heart beginning to race with familiar fear. "Determination has a way of overcoming magical protections, especially when fueled by righteousness and mob mentality." Lucian's voice carried grim acceptance. "They believe they're hunting a witch and her demonic consort. Logic won't deter them from their holy mission." "I should go to them," Elara said, though every fiber of her being rebelled against the idea. "If I surrender myself, perhaps they'll leave you in peace." "Absolutely not." The authority in Lucian's voice stopped her before she could move toward the door. "They've already decided your guilt. Surrender would only confirm their suspicions while accomplishing nothing. Then what do? We prepare for a confrontation that was always inevitable." He moved to another cabinet, this one containing items that made Elara's breath catch, books that glowed with their own inner light, crystals that pulsed with contained energy, implements that spoke of powers beyond mortal understanding. "Lucian," she said quietly, "what are you?" He paused in his gathering, meeting her eyes across the room. "I am what I choose to be, just as you are. The question now is what we choose to become together." The voices outside grew closer, and with them came the scent of smoke and the sound of breaking branches. The sanctuary she had found was about to become a battleground, and Elara realized that the woman who faced this confrontation would bear no resemblance to the one who had fled Ravenshollow in terror. She was no longer running away from something. She was standing her ground for something and someone worth protecting. The ancient map spread across Lucian's desk like a living thing, its edges seeming to shift and breathe in the afternoon light. Drawn on parchment that felt older than memory, it showed the forest in impossible detail, every path, every hidden grove, every sacred place where the boundary between worlds grew thin. "Your ancestors knew this land well," Lucian said, tracing pathways that glowed faintly under his touch. "These markings show the old ways, the roots that predate your village by centuries." Elara leaned closer, fascinated by symbols that seemed familiar, despite being completely foreign to her conscious mind. "My ancestors? The Whitmores have deep roots in this valley, deeper than you know. His finger paused over a marking near the castle's location, a complex symbol that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. This mark represents a pact made long ago, a bond between my kind and yours that has protected both our peoples for generations. The afternoon had passed in a blur of revelation and preparation. The villagers' search had been temporarily thwarted by magical misdirection, their torches leading them in circles through parts of the forest that led nowhere. But Lucian warned that such protections wouldn't hold forever against determined faith and righteous anger. "What kind of pact?" Elara asked, though something deep in her bones already knew the answer would change everything. Lucian moved to another cabinet, this one sealed with locks that opened at his touch without visible keys. From within, he withdrew a pendant that made Elara's heart skip, a delicate silver piece, worked with the same symbols that covered the map, suspended on a chain that caught light like captured starfire. 3 centuries ago, a woman named Morgana Whitmore came to me seeking help. Her village, the settlement that would become Raven Shallow, was threatened by a plague that no earthly medicine could cure. He held the pendant up, watching it spin slowly in the window light. She was what your people would call a hedge witch, gifted with natural magic, but lacking the knowledge to wield it effectively. "Magic runs in my family?" The idea should have terrified her, but instead, Elara felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a missing piece of herself had finally clicked into place. In the female line, passed from mother to daughter like a secret inheritance. Lucian's eyes met hers. Morgana offered a bargain. I would use my power to cleanse the plague, and in return, her descendants would serve as guardians of the balance between the mortal world and the magical realm. The pendant continued its hypnotic rotation, and Elara found herself reaching for it without conscious thought. The moment her fingers touched the silver, warmth spread up her arm like liquid sunlight, and suddenly she could see the forest map with new eyes. The symbols weren't just markings, they were a language, a way of reading the land's hidden currents of power. The magic skipped several generations, Lucian continued, his voice gentle as he watched her reaction to the pendant. Your grandmother had the gift but never awakened it. Your mother showed no signs at all. I began to think the bloodline had finally run dry. But it didn't. Elara's voice came out as barely a whisper as understanding bloomed in her mind. The herbs I gathered, the way I could heal the animals, that wasn't just luck or knowledge. Natural magic, awakened by proximity to places of power. Lucian gestured toward the forest beyond the windows. Every time you walked these paths, you were training yourself without knowing it. Every moment of wonder you felt among the trees was your gift, recognizing its home. The pendant grew warmer in her hands, and suddenly she could feel something vast and ancient stirring beneath the surface of her consciousness. It was like discovering she had been only half awake for 53 years, finally opening eyes she didn't know she possessed. "The books they found in my belongings," she said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Someone planted them there, but they chose the right victim. The magic in your blood would have called to those artifacts, made their presence feel natural, even as your conscious mind rejected them." Lucian moved closer, his expression mixing wonder with concern. "But awakening power after so many years of dormancy can be dangerous. The gift needs careful guidance to avoid overwhelming its vessel." Outside, the sound of voices grew closer again, and this time they carried the organized cadence of a planned assault. Father Benedict's voice rose above the others, calling for divine protection against the forces of darkness. The villagers had overcome whatever misdirection had confused them and were approaching with renewed determination. "They're not going to give up," Elara said, though her fear felt distant now, muffled by the warmth flowing from the pendant. "No, they're not." Lucian moved to the window, his expression grim as he watched the approaching torches. Fear makes people capable of extraordinary determination. They believe they're fighting for their souls. Aren't they? The question slipped out before Elara could stop it, carrying with it all the uncertainty that still lingered beneath her growing acceptance of this new reality. Lucian turned to face her fully, his storm-grey eyes holding depths of sadness and hard-won wisdom. That depends on what you believe souls are for. If they're meant to cling to safety and familiar certainties, then perhaps we are a threat. But if they're meant to grow, to discover truth beyond comfortable lies, then we're offering salvation. The pendant pulsed against Elara's palm, and with each pulse she felt more connected to something larger than herself. The forest beyond the windows no longer looked like a collection of trees, but rather like a living entity with its own consciousness and purpose. "Teach me," she said suddenly, the words carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "Whatever time we have before they reach us, teach me to use what I am." Lucian's smile transformed his entire face, centuries of loneliness, giving way to hope and purpose. "Are you certain? Once awakened fully, there's no returning to the woman you were before." Elara thought of the cottage where she had slept on a straw pallet, of the endless days spent scrubbing floors and cooking meals for people who barely acknowledged her existence. She thought of the accusations and fear, of the way her neighbors had been so eager to believe the worst of her. "That woman was never truly alive," she said firmly. "She was just surviving, waiting for permission to exist. Then let's begin." Lucian moved to the map, placing his hands over the symbols that marked the castle's location. "But first, you need to understand what we're truly protecting." As his fingers traced the ancient markings, the map began to glow with soft, silver light, and Elara felt the pendant grow warm against her chest. Power flowed between them like a current, and suddenly she could sense the vast network of magical energy that ran beneath the forest, like underground rivers. "This isn't just my home," Lucian said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones. "It's a nexus point, a place where multiple worlds touch. For centuries, I've guarded the boundary between realms, ensuring that forces beyond mortal understanding don't spill into your world. And now I'm part of that guardianship, if you choose to be." His eyes met hers across the glowing map. "The pact your ancestor made was voluntary, and it remains so. You can still choose to leave, to find a new life elsewhere." The offer hung between them, genuine and freely given. Elara looked around the library with its impossible treasures, felt the magic singing in her blood, remembered the way Lucian had looked at her as if she was something precious rather than merely useful. "I choose to stay," she said, and the pendant flared with brilliant light as her decision sealed itself into reality. Outside, the villagers' voices grew closer, carrying torches and certainty, and the unshakable conviction that they were doing God's work. Inside the castle, two beings who had found each other across the vast spaces of loneliness, prepared to defend not just their sanctuary, but their right to exist beyond the narrow definitions others would impose upon them. The pendant burned against Elara's chest like a brand, and with that burning came visions that stole her breath and shattered everything she thought she knew about her life. Images flooded her mind, not memories, but something deeper, older, encoded in her very blood, like an inheritance written in starlight and shadow. She saw Morgana Whitmore as clearly as if the woman stood before her, tall and proud, with silver-streaked hair and eyes the same storm grey as Lucian's. But these weren't the eyes of a supplicant seeking help. They blazed with power barely contained, magic that crackled around her like visible lightning. She wasn't just a hedge witch, Elara gasped, the pendant's heat making it difficult to speak. She was something more. Lucian's expression grew grave as he watched her reaction to the awakening bloodline magic. "What do you see?" "Power, real power. She didn't come to you as a beggar, she came as an equal." Elara's voice strengthened as the visions clarified. "The pact wasn't about you saving the village. It was about two guardians joining forces to prevent something catastrophic." The pendant pulsed again, and suddenly Elara was experiencing Morgana's memories as if they were her own. She stood in this very library 3 centuries ago, but it looked different then, newer, filled with artifacts that hummed with contained energy. Across from her, a younger-looking Lucian listened with growing alarm as she explained what was coming. "The Void Walkers," Elara whispered, the words falling from her lips, though she had no idea what they meant. "They were trying to break through. How do you know that name?" Lucian's voice carried sharp urgency. "I never mentioned, because she's here." Elara pressed her hand to the pendant, feeling the connection deepen. Morgana, her consciousness, her memories, her power, she bound them all into this pendant as a safeguard. She knew the threat would return. The visions intensified, showing her glimpses of creatures that existed between dimensions, beings of pure hunger that devoured magic, light, hope itself. They had been pressing against the barriers between worlds for millennia, seeking a way into realms rich with the life force they craved. "The plague that threatened the village," Elara continued, her voice taking on harmonics that weren't entirely her own. "It wasn't natural. It was the first sign of incursion, a weakening of the barriers, as the Voidwalkers tested the boundaries." Lucian moved closer, his expression mixing wonder with growing concern. "Elara, you need to be careful. Channeling ancestral memories can be overwhelming for someone newly awakened." But she was already too deep in the connection to pull back safely. More memories flooded through her, the ritual Morgana and Lucian had performed to strengthen the barriers, the price they had both paid for that protection, and the terrible knowledge that their victory was only temporary. 70 years, she said, her voice now carrying clear traces of Morgana's inflection. That was how long the barriers would hold before needing to be renewed. But the magic required specific bloodlines, specific knowledge, specific sacrifice. "The renewal was supposed to happen 30 years ago," Lucian said quietly. "But your mother showed no magical sensitivity, and your grandmother died before she could be properly trained. I thought the pact had ended. It didn't end. It was waiting." Elara's eyes opened, though she didn't remember closing them. When she spoke, it was with absolute certainty. "The barriers are failing now. The blight that affected the livestock, the strange weather patterns, the growing fear and suspicion in the village, these are all signs of dimensional weakening." The pendant grew hotter still, and suddenly she could feel them vast presences pressing against reality, like fingers against a soap bubble, testing for the moment when pressure would overcome resistance. "They're using the villagers," she continued, Morgana's knowledge filling the gaps in her understanding. "Fear and hatred weaken the barriers faster than time alone. Every torch they carry, every accusation they make, every act of violence they contemplated, all feeds the incursion." Lucian's face went pale as the implications struck him. "Then this confrontation isn't about prejudice or superstition. It's being orchestrated by forces beyond the villagers' understanding." "Father Benedict," Elara said suddenly, the pendant's heat becoming almost unbearable. "He's not just a zealous priest. Show me his face again." Lucian moved to the window, where the approaching search party was now clearly visible. Father Benedict walked at their head, his black robes billowing in wind that seemed to move independently of the natural breeze. When Elara looked at him through her newly awakened sight, she saw darkness clinging to him like a second shadow. "He's been touched by the void," she breathed, "not possessed, but influenced, guided to create the exact conditions needed to weaken our defenses." The priest's zealotry wasn't entirely his own. It had been carefully nurtured and directed by entities that understood how mortal fear could be, weaponized against the magical protections that kept them at bay. "The books planted in my belongings," Elara continued, "pieces of an impossible puzzle falling into place. They weren't meant to frame me for witchcraft. They were meant to force an awakening before I was properly prepared, hoping the shock would shatter my mind and leave the bloodline broken. But it didn't work," Lucian observed, studying her face for signs of the mental fracturing that had destroyed other magical bloodlines throughout history. "Because I'm not alone," Elara touched the pendant again, feeling Morgana's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. She prepared for this possibility. The pendant doesn't just contain her memories, it contains her strength, her training, her accumulated power. She's been waiting 3 centuries to finish what she started. The enormity of it all crashed over her, then the realization that her entire life had been shaped by forces she couldn't see, that every choice that had led her to this moment had been part of a pattern laid down before her birth. The quiet marriage to Thomas, who had unknowingly carried protective magic in his bloodline, the years of servitude that had kept her safely hidden while her power slowly matured. Even Margareth's cruelty, which had driven her toward the forest where Lucien could find her. "I was never meant to live an ordinary life," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she grieved for the woman she had thought she was. Everything, my marriage, my widowhood, the accusations, all of it, was orchestrated to bring me here at exactly the right moment. "Not orchestrated," Lucien said gently, moving to take her hands in his. "Guided, perhaps, by forces that work on timescales beyond mortal understanding. But the choices were still yours. The kindness you showed, the courage you're displaying now, the love you're capable of, those things can't be manufactured by destiny." The pendant's heat reached a crescendo, and suddenly Elara felt the full weight of her inheritance settling into her bones. Power flowed through her like molten gold, reshaping her from the inside out. When she looked in the mirror across the room, she barely recognized the woman staring back the same face, but eyes that now held depths of knowledge and strength that hadn't been there moments before. "The villagers," she said, her voice now carrying authority that made the air itself seem to listen. "They're not our enemies. They're victims, being used as weapons against us. If we can break the Voidwalker's influence over Father Benedict, we can stop this confrontation before it weakens the barriers beyond repair. And if we can't?" Elara looked at the ancient map spread across the desk, seeing now how the lines of power converged on this exact location. The castle wasn't just Lucien's home, it was the nexus point, where multiple dimensional barriers intersected, the keystone that held the entire protective network in place. "Then we perform the renewal ritual ourselves," she said, though Morgana's memories made clear what that would cost them both. "And we pray that love is stronger than the darkness pressing against our world." Outside, the voices grew closer, carrying torches that burned with unnatural fire and hearts that had been carefully prepared for violence. But inside the castle, 2 guardians, who had found each other across centuries of loneliness, prepared to defend not just their sanctuary, but the very fabric of reality itself. The pendant cooled against her chest, its work complete. Elara, Whitmore village widow and accused witch, had died in the awakening fire. In her place stood someone infinitely older and more dangerous, Morgana's true heir, wielding power that had been 3 centuries in the making. The crystal orb of truth sat on Lucien's desk like a captured star, its faceted surface refracting the afternoon light into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Elara understood now why her eyes watered when she tried to focus on it. The orb didn't just show reality, it revealed the deepest truths that mortals spent their lives trying to hide from themselves. "It will force everyone to see their true motivations," Lucien explained, as he carefully wrapped the orb in black silk. "No lies, no self-deception, no comfortable rationalizations, just raw, unfiltered truth." "Including our own?" Elara asked, though Morgana's memories had already shown her the answer. "Especially our own." His storm-grey eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you prepared for that level of honesty?" The question carried weights beyond its surface meaning. In the space of a few hours, Elara had discovered that her entire life had been shaped by forces beyond her understanding, that she carried the power and responsibility of an ancient bloodline, and that her growing feelings for Lucien were part of a pattern that had repeated across centuries. The orb would strip away even the possibility of romantic illusion, revealing whether what burned between them was genuine connection or merely magical destiny playing out according to predetermined scripts. "I've lived 53 years, believing comfortable lies," she said, touching the pendant that still pulsed warm against her chest. "I think I can handle a few uncomfortable truths." The sound of approaching voices grew, louder, punctuated now by the crash of branches being forced aside, and the determined cadence of men who had moved beyond anger into the cold realm of righteous purpose. Through the tall windows they could see torch flames dancing between the trees, their light wrong somehow too bright, too eager, fed by more than mere wood and oil. Void touched fire, Lucian observed grimly. They're burning with borrowed power, which makes them far more dangerous than simple human prejudice. Elara moved to the window and focused her newly awakened sight on the approaching mob. What she saw made her stomach clench with a mixture of pity and terror. The villagers she had known all her life moved like people caught in a waking dream, their faces slack with unnatural purpose, while shadows clung to them like parasites feeding on their fear and hatred. "Look at Willem," she whispered, pointing to the young blacksmith who walked near the front of the group, where once his face had held kindness in quiet strength. Now his eyes blazed with fanatic fervor. Dark veins stood out against his skin like ink spilled beneath the surface, and his mouth moved constantly in what might have been prayers or curses. "The void influence is stronger than I thought," Lucian said, his voice carrying genuine alarm. "They're not just being guided, they're being consumed. If we don't break the connection soon, there won't be enough of their original selves left to save." Father Benedict's voice rose above the others, no longer recognizably human in its harmonics. The words were Latin, but twisted into patterns that made the air itself seem to writhe with discomfort. Ancient syllables that predated Christianity, designed to weaken the barriers between worlds and invite in the hungry darkness that waited beyond the veil. "He's performing the counter-ritual," Elara said, Morgana's knowledge translating the priest's chanting. "Everything we're about to do to strengthen the barriers, he's working, to tear them down. Then we need to move quickly." Lucian gathered items from around the library, crystals that hummed with contained energy. Books bound in scales that might have belonged to creatures that never swam in earthly oceans. Implements forged from metals that didn't appear on any periodic table. The orb will show them the truth of what they're doing, but it can only work if they're willing to see. Void influence makes people cling to their delusions, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Elara helped him arrange the materials, according to patterns Morgana's memories provided. The setup was complex, requiring precise geometric relationships between objects of power, but her inherited knowledge guided her hands as if she had performed this ritual 1,000 times before. "There's something else," she said as they worked. "The renewal ritual, the one that will restore the barriers permanently. Morgana's memories show me what it requires." Lucian's hands stilled. On the crystal he was positioning. "Tell me." "A voluntary sacrifice from each guardian bloodline. Not death," she added quickly, seeing his expression, "but transformation. The human half of the partnership must accept full awakening to their magical nature, while the vampire must." She paused, struggling with concepts that existed beyond normal language. "You must open yourself completely to the life force. Allow it to flow through you in ways that will change your fundamental nature." "What kind of change?" "I don't know. Morgana's memories suggest that the vampires who have undergone the transformation become something entirely new, still immortal, but no longer bound by the traditional limitations of your kind. The implications hung between them, like a bridge they might not survive crossing. For Elara, full magical awakening would mean leaving behind any possibility of returning to a normal human life. For Lucian, the transformation might destroy the very nature that had defined him for centuries. "And if we refuse?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The barriers fail completely within days. The Void Walkers break through in sufficient numbers to begin the systematic consumption of our reality." She met his eyes across the ritual space. Everything dies, not just in our world, but in all the connected dimensions that depend on this nexus point for stability. The weight of cosmic responsibility settled over them like a mantle neither had asked to wear. They were just two beings who had found unexpected connection in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart, and now the fate of multiple realities rested on their willingness to sacrifice everything familiar for the sake of strangers who would never know what had been preserved on their behalf. "No pressure," Lucian said with a wry smile that didn't quite hide the fear in his eyes. Before Elara could respond, the cottage's protective wards flared with warning. Light. The villagers had reached the castle's outer boundaries, their void-touched torches burning away the magical concealment that had hidden Lucian's home for centuries. "They're here," she said unnecessarily. Through the windows, they could see the mob spreading out to surround the castle, their movements coordinated with military precision, despite being performed by farmers and merchants who had never received tactical training. Father Benedict stood at their center, his arms raised as he continued the counter-ritual that sent visible cracks spreading through the air itself. "The orb first," Lucian decided, lifting the crystal sphere from its silk wrapping. "If we can break their conditioning, we might be able to avoid violence entirely." But even as he spoke, they both knew it wouldn't be that simple. The void influence had sunk too deep, fed too well on years of carefully nurtured fear and resentment. The villagers weren't coming to talk, they were coming to purge what they saw as a stain on their community's purity, and nothing short of complete victory would satisfy the hunger that now drove them. "Together then," Elara said, placing her hands over his on the orb's surface. The crystal flared with brilliant light as their combined power flowed into it, and suddenly the truth sight spread outward like ripples on a pond, washing over the approaching mob with inexorable force. For a moment, silence fell over the forest, as 30 human minds were forced to confront the reality of what they were doing and why. Willem was the first to break. He staggered backward from the group, his face twisted with horror as he saw the darkness that had been feeding on his thoughts. "What have we done?" he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the supernatural quiet. One by one, other villagers began to shake off the void influence, their expressions shifting from fanatic certainty to confused terror, as they remembered who they really were beneath the imposed hatred. Some fell to their knees, weeping for the thoughts they had been made to think. Others simply turned and fled back toward Ravenshollow, wanting nothing more than to escape the nightmare their lives had become. But Father Benedict stood unmoved at the center of the dissolving mob, his chanting growing louder as the orb's truth light revealed what he truly was. The darkness that clung to him wasn't just influence, it was integration. The man who had led Ravenshollow's faithful for 20 years was gone, consumed from within by an entity that wore his flesh like an ill-fitting coat. "He's too far gone," Lucian said grimly, watching as shadows began to pour from the priest's form like smoke from a funeral pyre. "The void has taken him completely." The thing that had been Father Benedict raised its head, and when it spoke, its voice contained harmonics that belonged to no earthly throat. "You cannot stop what comes, guardians. The barriers weaken with each passing moment, and my kind hunger for the feast your world represents." Around the possessed priest, reality began to fracture in visible ways. Cracks appeared in the air itself, revealing glimpses of the hungry void that pressed against the boundaries of existence. Through those tears, Elara caught sight of things that made her newly awakened mind recoil, entities of pure consumption that existed only to devour light, life, hope, and meaning itself. "The renewal ritual," she said urgently, turning to Lucian. "It has to be now, while the orb's power is still active. If we wait any longer, there won't be enough barrier strength left to work with." Lucian nodded, his expression resolute, despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "Are you ready for this, Elara? Once we begin, there's no going back to who we were." She looked around the library that had become her sanctuary. At the man who had shown her kindness, when her own people had cast her out, at the impossible beauty of a life she had never dared to dream possible. Then she looked beyond the windows at the spreading cracks in reality and the darkness that sought to devour everything she had come to cherish. "I've been ready my whole life," she said, taking his hand in hers. "I just didn't know it until now." The staff of ancient oak materialized in Elara's hands as if it had been waiting centuries for her touch. Carved from the heartwood of the first tree to grow in this valley, it pulsed with the accumulated power of every season it had witnessed, every storm it had weathered, every moment of growth and change it had sheltered. The moment her fingers closed around its smooth surface, she felt the full weight of her heritage settle into her bones like coming home. "I claim my birthright," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the castle stones themselves hum in response. "I am Morgana's heir, guardian of the threshold, keeper of the balance." The staff blazed with silver-white light that pushed back the encroaching darkness spreading from Father Benedict's position. Where its radiance touched the cracks in reality, they began to seal, the hungry void beyond them shrieking in frustration as its access points closed one by one. Lucian moved to stand beside her, his own transformation already beginning as the renewal ritual activated. His pale skin took on an otherworldly luminescence, and his storm-grey eyes deepened to colors that had no names in human language. The vampire she had come to love was changing before her eyes, becoming something that belonged neither to darkness nor light, but to the space between worlds where true guardians dwelt. "The accusations were true," Elara said, raising the staff toward the thing that wore Father Benedict's face. "I am indeed a witch, but not the kind your limited understanding imagined." Her words rang across the forest, clearing with the authority of absolute truth. The remaining villagers who had shaken off the void influence stared in awe, as power flowed around her like visible wind, lifting her graying hair and setting her simple dress ablaze with starlight. The possessed priest responded with a howl that shattered windows throughout the castle, its voice containing the anguish of 1,000 consumed souls. "You think your pathetic magic can stand against the endless hunger? We have devoured civilizations that spanned galaxies. Your little world is but an appetizer before the feast." "Perhaps," Elara replied calmly, feeling Morgana's confidence flowing through her like molten gold. "But you've never faced guardians who chose love over fear, connection over isolation, sacrifice over survival." She gestured with the staff, and the earth beneath the priest's feet began to glow with the same silver light. Ancient symbols appeared in the grass, not carved, but growing, as if the land itself was writing words of protection in living script. The void entity possessing Father Benedict tried to step away from the expanding circle of power, but found itself unable to move. The binding wasn't physical, it was metaphysical, trapping it between realities while the renewal ritual built toward its crescendo. "You cannot hold me," the thing snarled, its stolen voice cracking with strain. "I am eternal hunger, endless consumption. I am the heat death of stars and the silence after the last song." "You are terrified," Elara observed, her newly awakened sight reading the entity's true nature beneath its grandiose claims. "You feed on fear because you are fear, the cosmic anxiety that whispers that nothing matters, that all love ends in loss, that existence itself is meaningless suffering." The staff grew brighter in her hands as understanding deepened. This wasn't just about maintaining dimensional barriers or protecting her world from invasion. This was about proving that meaning could exist in the face of entropy, that love could persist despite loss, that hope could flourish even in the shadow of inevitable endings. Around them, reality stabilized as the renewal ritual reached its midpoint. The cracks in the air sealed completely, cutting off the Voidwalker's access to this dimension. But Elara could feel the tremendous effort required to maintain the barriers, the constant pressure of hungry darkness seeking new ways through. "The transformation isn't complete," Lucian said, his voice now carrying the deep resonance of someone who existed partially outside normal space-time. "We need to finish what we've started, or the barriers will fail again within days." Elara nodded, feeling the truth of his words in her bones. The staff had awakened her power, but awakening wasn't the same as full integration. To become a true guardian, she needed to surrender the last vestiges of her human limitations and embrace something larger than mortality. "Willem," she called to the young blacksmith who stood at the edge of the clearing, his face still streaked with tears from his page, awakening to what he had almost done. "Take the others back to Ravenshollow. Tell them what you've seen here. Help them understand that fear makes us vulnerable to things far worse than witches or vampires." The young man nodded, his expression mixing relief with dawning comprehension. "What about Father Benedict?" Elara looked at the thing that wore the priest's form, seeing past the void entity to the human consciousness trapped beneath layers of consumption and corruption. A spark remained faint, but still burning, despite everything that had been done to extinguish it. "Leave him to us," she said gently. "There may yet be something worth saving." As the villagers departed, hurrying away from forces beyond their understanding, Elara felt the final phase of the transformation beginning. The staff in her hands grew warm, then hot, then began to merge with her very being as the boundary between guardian and artifact dissolved. "Are you ready?" Lucian asked, his own metamorphosis, accelerating as ancient vampire nature gave way to something that had never existed before. "I've been ready all my life," she replied, though the woman who had spoken those words moments before was already fading into memory. "I just needed to remember who I was meant to become." The phoenix feather pendant appeared around Elara's neck as the transformation reached its crescendo, materializing from pure light and intention as Lucian's love for her took physical form. The feather blazed with colors that existed beyond the visible spectrum, each hue representing a different aspect of their bond: silver for trust, gold for passion, deep blue for the courage to change, and at its heart, a warmth that spoke of love, that transcended the boundaries of species, mortality, and time itself. "A gift," Lucian said, his voice now harmonizing with frequencies that made the air itself sing. "So you'll remember that transformation is not ending, but becoming." The pendant's warmth spread through her chest, and suddenly Elara could feel his presence not just beside her but within her, their consciousness beginning to interweave in ways that would have terrified her only hours before. She was still herself, still the woman who had loved quietly and served faithfully and dreamed of books and beauty, but now she was also more. The boundaries that had defined her were expanding, making room for power and purpose she had never imagined. "The binding ritual," she said, lifting the staff of ancient oak toward the void entity trapped in Father Benedict's form. "It's time to send this thing back where it belongs." But the entity wasn't finished fighting. As the phoenix pendant flared brighter, it realized that its window of opportunity was closing forever. With a shriek that shattered the remaining glass in the castle windows, it abandoned all pretense of using the priest's body and revealed its true form. A writhing mass of hungry darkness shot through with veins of sickly light, constantly consuming and reconstituting itself in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. "If I cannot feast on your world," it howled, "then I will drag you back with me to mine. The void hungers, guardians, and hunger is eternal." The entity launched itself at them with the speed of falling darkness, but it struck something it hadn't anticipated, not just two beings defending themselves, but a unified force that drew power from connection rather than consumption. Elara and Lucian moved as one, their transformed natures allowing them to exist partially outside normal time and space. The staff of ancient oak blazed with silver fire, while shadows flowed from Lucian's hands like liquid starlight, weaving together into barriers that the void entity couldn't penetrate. "You don't understand," Elara said, her voice now carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations of guardians. "We're not trying to destroy you. We're offering you something you've forgotten existed." She gestured with the staff, and instead of attack magic, what flowed from it was pure compassion, the recognition that even entities of cosmic hunger had once been something else, before eons of consumption had stripped away everything that wasn't appetite. The void entity recoiled as if struck by physical force. "Lies, there is only hunger, only emptiness waiting to be filled. There is choice," Lucian replied, his transformed nature allowing him to speak directly to the spark of original consciousness buried beneath layers of corruption. "Even for you, even now." The battle that followed wasn't fought with fire and lightning, but with competing visions of reality itself. The void entity pushed waves of despair and nihilism against them, visions of heat, death, and entropy, of love ending in loss, of all meaning eventually consumed by cosmic indifference. But Elara and Lucian responded with something infinitely more powerful, the lived truth that love creates meaning in the face of meaninglessness, that connection persists despite separation, that choosing to care for something beyond yourself transforms both the chooser and the chosen. The phoenix pendant grew so bright it became a small sun, its light revealing the truth the void entity had spent eons trying to forget, that it too had once chosen connection over isolation, had once been part of something beautiful before hunger had consumed everything else it had been. "Remember," Elara whispered, her voice carrying across dimensions. "Remember what you were before the hunger took you. Remember why you chose to exist at all." For a moment, the entity's form shifted, revealing glimpses of what it might have been, once a being of curiosity rather than consumption, wonder rather than hunger. But the moment passed, and it contracted back into familiar patterns of need and emptiness. "Too late," it snarled, though its voice carried notes of genuine grief. "Too much consumed, too little left to save." "Then go," Lucian said gently. "Return to your void, and perhaps someday you'll find the courage to choose differently." The renewal ritual reached its completion as Elara raised the staff one final time. The barriers between worlds solidified into something stronger than stone or steel, a lattice of connection and love that would hold for centuries without need of maintenance. The void entity, cut off from its food source and faced with the choice between transformation or exile, chose the familiar emptiness of its own dimension. "We will return," it promised as the portal closed around it. "Someday, when your love fails and your hope dims, we will be waiting." "We know," Elara replied peacefully, "and when that day comes, we'll make the same choice we made today, to love anyway, hope anyway, connect anyway." That's what guardians do. The entity vanished, taking with it the last traces of corruption from Father Benedict's unconscious form. The priest would live, though he would awake with no memory of his possession and a lingering sense that he needed to approach his faith with more humility and less certainty. As silence fell over the forest, Elara felt the transformation settle into her bones like coming home. She was no longer just a village widow or even just a powerful witch. She was a guardian, bound to this place and this purpose and this extraordinary man who had shown her that monsters could be more merciful than the supposedly righteous. Spring came early to the valley that year, as if the land itself celebrated the renewal of the ancient protections. Elara sat in her garden, their garden now, watching roses bloom in impossible profusion, while she wrote in the golden book of memories. The leather-bound journal had appeared on her writing desk 3 months after the confrontation, a gift from the castle itself, as it acknowledged her permanent residence within its ancient walls. The morning sun felt different against her skin now, warmer and more welcoming, despite the fact that she no longer needed its heat for comfort. The transformation had left her changed in fundamental ways, stronger, more aware of the currents of magic that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary life, capable of seeing connections that had always existed but remained invisible to purely human perception. "Another entry?" Lucian asked, settling into the chair beside her writing table. He looked younger somehow, as if taking on his new role as co-guardian had lifted weights from his shoulders that he had carried for centuries. The shadows that had clung to him during their first meeting were gone, replaced by an inner light that spoke of purpose fulfilled rather than duty endured. "The important moments should be recorded," Elara replied, dipping her pen in ink that shimmered with traces of silver. "Future guardians will need to understand how we got here, what was at stake, and why we chose as we did." She gestured toward the village below, where Ravenshollow went about its daily business with a peace that hadn't existed for generations. The blight that had threatened their livestock was gone, replaced by health and prosperity that seemed to flow from the very soil. Crops grew larger and more robust, animals thrived, and the children born since the renewal ritual possessed an unusual vitality that spoke of magical protections working as intended. "Willem stopped by yesterday," Lucian mentioned, watching a pair of hawks circle overhead in complex patterns that weren't entirely natural. "The new church construction is progressing well. The old chapel had been torn down after Father Benedict's recovery, when the priest himself declared that the building carried too many memories of darkness and corruption. In its place, the villagers were raising something unprecedented, a sanctuary dedicated not to any single faith, but to the celebration of life in all its forms. Willem had volunteered to lead the construction, his blacksmithing skills translating surprisingly well to architectural pursuits. Father Benedict blessed the foundation stones himself, Elara noted, smiling at the memory of the changed priest. His recovery from possession had left him humbler but not broken, wiser without losing his essential kindness. He preached now about the importance of seeing the sacred in unexpected places, of recognizing that divine protection could come through channels that didn't fit comfortable theological categories. A knock at the garden gate interrupted their peaceful morning. Sarah Miller approached with her usual shyness, though she carried herself with more confidence than she had possessed before the truth came to light about the witchcraft accusations. At 17, she showed clear signs of magical sensitivity. The same gift that had made her a target for suspicion now made her invaluable as a bridge between the village and its supernatural guardians. "Mistress Elara," Sarah said, using the Marigreen title the villagers had settled on after much debate. "There's a woman at the village border asking for sanctuary. She says she's been accused of witchcraft in the northern settlements." Elara exchanged glances with Lucian, both recognizing the pattern that was becoming increasingly common. Word of Ravenshallow's unusual tolerance was spreading through the region, drawing those who had been rejected by less enlightened communities. "What's your assessment?" Elara asked Sarah, valuing the girl's natural empathy as much as her magical perceptions. "She's frightened but not broken," Sarah reported. "And there's power in her, though she doesn't know how to use it safely. She reminds me of—" She paused, blushing slightly. "Of me," Elara finished with gentle amusement, "before I discovered what I was capable of becoming." Rising from her writing table, Elara gathered her shawl and prepared to welcome another refugee from narrow-minded fear. It had become a regular part of her duties, as guardian, not just protecting the dimensional boundaries, but offering sanctuary to those whose gifts made them targets in a world still learning to distinguish between different kinds of power. "I'll prepare the guest cottage," Lucian said, understanding her intention without need for discussion. The bond between them had deepened beyond romance into something that transcended ordinary relationship categories. They were partners in the truest sense, two halves of a greater whole, dedicated to protection and nurturing. As they walked toward the village together, Elara felt the familiar contentment that had replaced the restless longing of her previous life. This was what she had been searching for during all those months of walking in the forest, not escape from responsibility, but the right responsibility, the purpose that made use of all her capabilities rather than demanding their suppression. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked as they reached the village outskirts. "The life you had before?" Elara considered the question seriously, looking back at the woman she had been dutiful, invisible, slowly disappearing into the expectations others placed upon her. That woman's sacrifices had been real, and her quiet kindness had mattered in its own small way. But she had never been fully alive, never been permitted to grow into what she was capable of becoming. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she said honestly, "but I wouldn't trade complexity for completeness. That woman was only a fraction of who I was meant to be." They found the refugee at the village's informal boundary, a woman perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent eyes and hands that showed the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. Her story, when she told it, proved depressingly familiar: herbs that healed too well, knowledge that seemed too extensive for someone without formal education, the gradual accumulation of suspicion until accusation became inevitable. "You're safe here," Elara told her, meaning it absolutely. "Whatever you are, whatever gifts you carry, will help you understand and develop them safely." The woman's relief was palpable, tears streaming down her face as she realized her desperate flight had actually led somewhere worth arriving. It was a scene that repeated regularly now, Ravenshollow becoming a beacon for those who possessed abilities that frightened conventional communities. As evening approached, Elara returned to her writing desk to record the day's events in the Golden Book of Memories. The journal served multiple purposes: historical record, instruction manual for future guardians, and personal reflection on the ongoing process of transformation that never truly ended. "We are what we choose to become," she wrote, watching the silver ink dry on cream-colored pages. "Not what others expect us to be, not what fear tells us we must remain, but what love makes possible when we have the courage to embrace change." Outside her, a window, the garden roses continued their impossible bloom, and somewhere in the distance, Lucian's laughter mixed with the sound of children playing in streets that were no longer shadowed by suspicion and fear. The future stretched ahead like an unwritten book, full of possibilities that included both joy and sorrow, challenge and triumph. But for the first time in her life, Elara faced that future not as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but as a guardian with the power to shape what came next. That transformation, more than any magical ability, was the greatest gift she had received, the understanding that she had always possessed the strength to change her story. She just needed to give herself permission to pick up the pen.